You're listening to Proven Perspectives, a podcast with John Hawkins, the founder of Leadership Edge. I'm Laura, John's daughter, and in each episode, we'll explore a topic related to life, leadership, or mentoring. Through over 50 years of faith in Christ, John has learned proven life and leadership perspectives that will equip listeners for a lifestyle of leadership in their marriages, families, careers, communities, and churches. Hey, Dad.
Hey, Laura, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you? What has your day been like?
Well, I have been mainly in the office. I had a meeting I had to run out for a little bit earlier today, but we are in May gray
Yeah,
here.
we are.
This weather, I moved to Southern California. What happened to the warm and sunny? And we're kind of cloudy and cool.
It's not really
for the last
Memorial
few
Day
weeks.
barbecue weather, is it? But we're going to jump in the pool
No.
anyway, so ready or not,
That's
here we
exactly
go.
right.
Yeah.
Are you and your family doing all right
Yeah,
today?
we're good. Just kind of trucking along. It's funny. Our topic today, I was just, before we got on the podcast, thinking about, oh gosh, what are we going to have for dinner? Which I always think of how you and Mom used to call it the nightly problem. And now I understand
The nightly problem. Yes.
But our topic today actually made me think, it's been a long time since I've had Stouffer's lasagna. Maybe I should either pick up one or whip together some sort of lasagna for dinner tonight. So anyways, yeah, that was just what I was thinking about right before this. So
It's an easy
seriously,
fix.
so
And with your kids, get some French bread or Italian bread to go with it, and they will be happy campers.
Seriously. They do love French bread for sure.
Yes.
So Dad, I know we have an interesting topic and a special guest with us today. So why don't you tell us about both?
Oh, we do. Yeah. Well, at Leadership Edge, we are celebrating our 30th anniversary that we've, by God's grace, been around for 30 years. And as the founder, that's especially meaningful to me that this thing worked and that God was in it and that we've had a really great history. This is my last year of full-time employment, as we've talked about on some of the podcasts. Next April of 2024, I'll be retiring. And so we're going to be doing some different podcasts that have things to do with the history of Leadership Edge. And so today we're going to be talking about what we're calling being first, and that is going from mentor and mentee to lifelong friends. And what we mean by going first is we have with us today Bob Hostetter. And Bob was the first student that was mentored through Leadership Edge at Duke University when we were getting started in 1994 and 95. And now Bob is, he'll tell you about himself, but he's a professional, married, kids, all that. And we're going to be talking some today about, his experience of being the first guy mentored through Leadership Edge way back then, but then just the kind of the history of mine and his relationship and how it's really kind of moved from mentor-mentee to two friends and brothers in Christ. So, Bob, we sure welcome you to the podcast.
Well, John and Laura, happy to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks so much for saying that I'm first. I don't know how do you respond to that. I mean, it's kind of an unusual thing to say about somebody, but I guess that is how the calendar falls, and it doesn't seem like 30 years on my end.
Well, Bob, I'm excited. I mean, I think it's probably been almost 30 years since I've seen you in person. So I'm looking forward to getting to hear a little bit about what your life is like now. And I think it'll be really fun for our listeners too. So why don't you start by just kind of giving us a bio, where you're from, how you came to faith, some things about your time at Duke and your story since Duke, and definitely make sure to talk about Heather and your kids. So fill us in.
All right. Well, I'll try to be brief. I mean, it is 30 years, right. So I'll John already covered the Duke part, but I grew up in Washington, D.C. With regard to my faith upbringing, my mom was a believer. My father wasn't. I came to faith reasonably early in my life, and then grew over time. I joined InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which was a big part of my life while I was at Duke, and that's kind of how John and I got to know each other. I was helping to book speakers for InterVarsity's Friday night large group meetings. And so John was somebody that, kept drawing crowds. And so we kept bringing him back. And, that was really good. And, I guess we'll talk a little more about the mentoring piece later, but, professionally following Duke, worked for a bunch of different software startups in the late 90s. And then I transitioned more fully into financial services and have been in the leadership of a number of larger asset management firms, and now reside in Dallas, Texas, of all places, with my wife, Heather, and my daughter, Maddie, and son, Caleb. So it's been a fun ride. It's the weather you were mentioning earlier is gray there in California. You can join the many others who've decided to come to Dallas, where the weather is beautiful on this Memorial Day
Oh,
weekend.
that's awesome. Well, good. Well, hope you're going to have a barbecue or get outside or do something fun. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, so I would love to hear from both of you on this next question, and we'll start with Bob. So, what do you remember about your mentoring relationship while Bob was at Duke? And I guess specifically, what it was like in those days and what the short-term impact was. So, Bob, do you mind going first?
Yeah, no, not at all. And Laura, I do remember those days quite well. And it's funny. I mentioned my kids. I think you were probably about the age of my daughter, Maddie, at the time. And I had, my son's probably about the age of probably about Gary's age at that point in time, John.
Yep.
And, for me, it was just a really neat experience to get a chance to be, in your family. For all of you, I see what that is like now in terms of, kind of my life and what, your life was like back then. But I didn't really fully appreciate how, great that was. I was an only child. I didn't have much of a family. My relationship with my dad was, different. I mean, he was not a believer. And in a lot of ways, there were a number of things that, despite my involvement in Christian fellowship and the work that I had done studying God's word, it really was just really different to spend time with someone who had been doing it and had done it before, and then to kind of talk through the experiences that I was having in the middle of my desire to follow God, and to work through over time different areas that it just takes a friend, and I think that's the biggest takeaway for me, was just that it was God's plan for me to meet John. It was God's plan for me to get to spend time with him and with all of you, really. And that was a great memory that I had during my senior year.
No, that's cool. Yeah, I have a follow-up question for you with that. But first, one thing my dad was telling me that you had told him recently was that you used to always wonder, we would all be wandering into the kitchen as he was maybe getting it pulled together and grabbing snacks. And you were like, why does he let them eat snacks? And then now you understand.
I can completely relate.
Which, so do I. But I thought that was really...
All new construction homes should come with a lock on the pantry.
That's a great idea.
I don't know how they managed to construct. It would be a great idea.
Yeah, totally. So basically, some of what you saw after growing up as an only child was just good and bad. What normal family, but with parents who are walking with Christ, what that looked like. That's kind of a synopsis of some of...
Yeah, it's just, I think the thing that was most impactful for me was that John and your family was willing to be authentic with me. And that was an invitation for me to be authentic with you.
And so the question I had for you is, because I don't quite remember, would you guys would have a meeting, the two of you, and then you'd stay for dinner? Or was that your mentoring time was that same evening, or what did that look like?
Yeah, we did that. I don't know if we did dinner every time. And John, you might remember better than this, because you were graciously picking up the food bill, so I don't remember. I was just a hungry college student at that point in time. But I do think that we would spend time one on one. It wasn't as though everything that I was saying was in front of the entire family.
No, yeah.
But it was we'd go on a walk, we'd be somewhere. I mean, it was just kind of things would be going on. Somebody be going to soccer somewhere. We drive somewhere and we talk in the car. I mean, it's fun. It was just kind of like, I was flexible. I had, it was all part of the experience from my perspective.
Yeah, that's neat. Dad, what do you remember?
Well, I remember, all the parts that Bob just shared about. I remember, it was obvious that Bob was very bright, academically, that he was a really good student, applied himself well to his studies. He's spoken about, his relationship with his father was a difficult one. I always saw in Bob such a longing to try to figure out, in the context of a difficult relationship, how to still, as best he could, honor his father. And that just stood out to me because, sometimes when relationships are hard, we just kind of bail out. And I appreciated how Bob really wrestled with that. And then another thing, like if you saw Bob then, if you see him today, he's a man in full. He's certainly a strong and sturdy guy, but he has a really tender heart. And it was surprising to me when I got to know him. I didn't maybe anticipate that. And yet, as we would talk about things of the Lord, we would talk about how he was growing or changing, or things God was challenging him in, or difficult parts of his life. At different times he would even weep over things. And I appreciated that so much, that the things that he was thinking about, that God was growing him in, the things, just in a young man's life in his college years, they were going all the way into his heart. And it was a pleasure. And then I think, personally, on the me side of this, when we came to Duke, Leadership Edge was a concept. It was an idea. It had never been done before. It wasn't, a traditional Christian campus ministry. It was a leadership development organization. And we knew at the core of what we were going to do, mentoring was going to be the most impactful part. And so the dirty little secret was, I didn't know if that was going to work at Duke. I didn't know if it would be of value to Duke students and how that would be. But as the relationship with Bob just kind of took off, and he's obviously, appreciative and growing and learning from it, it was an affirmation to me from God that what he had called us to do, he was going to bless, and it was going to be of benefit.
No, that's really cool. Yeah, that's interesting to think of you had done something, I guess, in a somewhat similar vein in Texas, but just a completely different culture. And yeah, this is how interesting to think that as you guys were starting off the relationship, you weren't really sure how it was going to work or what God was going to do through it. That's really, just kind of interesting to imagine. Go ahead.
Yeah, nor I don't think Bob or I, either one, had any notion that, 30 years later, we would have not only the friendship and brotherhood that we have today, but have had throughout those 30 years a number of different times to be together, to work together, to learn from each other. All that's kind of a rare thing.
Yeah, that's really neat. Well, and I want to ask you a little bit more about that in a minute. But one thing I wanted to, before we moved on, ask you, Bob, is so as we've established, that's been roughly 30 years. And so, your family life has changed and now you're leading in financial investments. As you look at it now, has there been a sustained impact from the mentoring relationship, or how would you describe that?
Laura, I think there has. I think that the main thing that, the main thing that I took away from the mentoring relationship was just, I think a lot of courage to kind of step forward. It's something that is brought up in the Leadership Edge mentoring statement now, which was kind of part of the curriculum, but it was also looser than it is now in terms of it being really central. And, I see that as being something that's pretty important for me. In terms of my upbringing, I was encouraged not to take a lot of risks. It was something that was harder for me. And, I feel like I was able to take some risks in my career, but also, take some risks in terms of doing things that other people weren't necessarily doing. And kind of going going maybe against what others have done. And I think that's really pretty impactful. I've traveled around a lot. I've been involved in a lot of different churches and other types of ministries, but really there hasn't been the same kind of impact sustained from those types of interactions that there has been for me from the mentoring kind of a relationship.
So can you give, not to put you on the spot, but can you think of like a specific example of like kind of a risky choice that you made that flowed out of either what you learned in mentoring or out of your faith?
Well, yeah. So one thing was when Heather and I got married, I had been working at McKinsey for an extended period of time, and McKinsey is a great place, but it wasn't really consistent with the kind of experience that I wanted from this wasn't enough time to invest. And so, I think that one of the riskier decisions was to leave McKinsey, following getting married.
Yeah.
And to take a bit of a different path, to just reprioritize things in view of the new commitments that I had. And that was pretty risky from the standpoint of, something that was a pretty clear career path that was, ahead of me, to something that maybe, wasn't as clear, but it felt like God was saying, this is something you gotta do.
Yeah. No, that's a great example. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Well, and Dad, I know that you alluded to like the opportunities that God's given the two of you to collaborate at different points through the years. And one of those, I believe, was a trip to Central Asia, as well as Bob being on the board and then the Hostetters helping with Leadership Edge's work in Dallas. So I was wondering, could we go through each of those and kind of like ping pong it back and forth, but just share a little bit about what you've seen God do through that. So, Dad, you want to start us off this time?
Yeah. So I was asked a couple of times to go to a country in Central Asia to work with a Christian ministry there who was trying to mainstream into business missions kind of work within their country. They had an alliance with a business school there and with the U.S. Embassy. And so I was asked twice to go there and basically do workshops for a week around our lifestyle leadership model and other stuff we had developed. And so, the second time as I was thinking about that trip, Bob at that time was with McKinsey. He had just been to some big leadership development program that McKinsey had put on in Europe. And I was like, I should get Bob to go. He would be really good at this. And he would have a lot of credibility and a lot of knowledge that I just didn't have. And so at that time, Bob was still single. And so I called Bob up, and somehow he was kind enough and willing enough to do this at his own expense, to meet me in this country and to work with these friends there. So I just remember from that, Bob's kindness in doing it. And again, how good he was at it. The stuff that the sessions he led were just top notch. And I remember one thing about that trip was we both got there and were pretty jet lagged, but we knew that we couldn't go to sleep, because if we did, before it was bedtime, we would be kind of screwed up the whole time. So I remember he and I walking around this neighborhood trying to keep me awake as I'm about to fall asleep. So that's a little bit. And then the family that we got to interact with, I just remember how Bob and I both enjoyed getting to know them and getting to know their kids and all that. So Bob, that's a 69-year-old man's memory of that. And anything you remember differently, or anything you think I just made up?
No, you didn't make it up. I still remember the ringing of the mosque at 5 a.m. in case jet lag wasn't challenging enough.
That's right.
That was pretty remarkable, as well as the fact that it was pitch black.
Yes,
all throughout the night. So it was interesting. It was an interesting place, but really, special in a lot of ways too. The thing that really struck me was a little less about the the classroom dynamics of the leadership classes that we were doing, and more about the relationships that, our host had with the local community. And, I mean, it's Central Asia is an amazing place. There's someone on every block is the baker, and they have, these wood, these, what we would call, wood fired stoves to make bread. Like you have wood fired pizzas, but they make bread in there. And, and they make that because, people bring bread. It talks in the Bible about, do you have bread? Yeah. And that's, that's kind of a pretty neat, it's a pretty neat thing. And it speaks to a culture of hospitality and a pace of life that's just so different than what we have here. People would just come over and just talk for, 2-3 hours at our host house. He was extremely gracious.
Yes.
And, it just, I think as somebody who's very, prone to being very task oriented, the thing that I took away was just how important these relationships are to the folks who have been in our, in their lives. And so it's just super exciting.
That's really neat. What a neat way to see you guys is, I guess, relationship transition from, like being, I don't want to say one way, because I'm sure, Dad, you got things out of the mentoring relationship early on, but to the opportunity to go on this trip and both of you kind of investing together and both of you learning and being recipients. And that's just sounds like a really neat trip. So I'd also love to hear about Bob serving on the board. Bob, why don't you start us off on that one?
Yeah. So at that point, I hadn't done a lot of board service. So John was, again, generous in letting me participate. And I wasn't exactly sure what all that I was supposed to do. But I think the things that I picked up mostly was just that it was a level of transparency that John was sharing with me as part of being a member of that board that was, again, humbling from my perspective. And I think that it speaks a lot to John and how he operates and how he chose to operate Leadership Edge, that, there was a lot of transparency around, what the organization was doing, what it was focused on, how resources were being allocated. And, again, that transparency was very, very, it was very humbling for me. And again, something that I also took away from that in terms of saying how, again, it was something that I could learn from and say, this is something that's an importance, and it's a value that I should be striving towards.
That's awesome. Dad, what do you remember?
When I started Leadership Edge in 93, I was talking to a friend about, what kind of people should I have on the board? And this friend was very well-intentioned, but I didn't agree with what he said. He said, you basically just need friends that will rubber stamp everything you want to do. And that's the kind of people that you need on your board. Well, I knew enough to know that couldn't be right. Yeah. And so, we have consistently had board members who love the organization, who love me personally, but who are not there to just, make me feel good about everything. And I think the thing with Bob, when he was serving, he was just honest. And he would listen to, as I was giving reports on things, or we were discussing things, or, what to do in different situations, how to grow the organization, how to grow the funding. And Bob would always just be straight up honest. And sometimes his honesty was not particularly comfortable for me because, it was pushing me to have to do something differently or think about something differently or admit that we're not as in a good position on this or that as we hoped we would be. But, the thing about Bob's honesty was I knew the heart that it came from, and I knew the commitment that was behind it to me and to Leadership Edge. So I just felt that Bob was a great asset because he knew a lot of things about leadership, about business, and he was willing to just put things forward, to not pussyfoot around things, but to just say things straight up. And that was a great great service and benefit. And it was kind of a flip of the relationship of now he's my boss. Like I report to the board. And so during the time that Bob was on the board, he was one of my bosses. And that I think that shows something about just the nature of our relationship that has gone through so many twists and iterations as to roles and all that.
So did that ever create tension, like him pushing back or needing to say hard things? Or I'd love to hear more about that.
I think it created tension inside of me, not in terms of, does Bob like me or does he, anything like that. But it was just, it's kind of as iron sharpens iron kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, it did produce tension that is that kind of tension that leads you to grow, that leads you to not stay the same. Because I think anytime you're the founder of an organization, though you don't realize it, you do tend to build things around what you're good at and what you're comfortable. And that's not all bad, but you need people to push you.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But Bob, how do you remember that? Do you ever remember there being tension between us?
I don't really. I think that there were, if I recall, I think there was maybe some down economic years, in terms of that sequence. And so I think there were some, natural sources of tension that all organizations, go through. In terms of, stock market's down or, the economy's in a recession or whatever those kind of things might be. So I think we were navigating through some of those things. And I think, I don't recall there being a lot of tension, but I'm often someone who has ideas and, that can create some pressure for those who have to execute on them. Right. And so I think that's probably a little bit of what that looks like. And, I think Leadership Edge has evolved and changed. I think it's done so in a really deliberate way. And I think in a way that's been really healthy. But I do think that it's, and some of those, some of those reasons for its growth, in fact, most of those reasons for this growth had nothing to do with my ideas, just to be clear. So, but I do think it's part of a process of examination that is good for, I think, John, you're right. It's good for an organization to go through that, to say, okay, let's take stock of, what is working, what could be working better, what are the root causes for some of those things, what could be addressed, what haven't we thought about? And I think that over time, and one of the things that I've been excited about is with Todd's arrival and sort of the expansion of what he's able to do. He has some abilities to execute in different ways, and I think complementary ways to some of the things that John has brought. And I think that has been good. I think that it has been good. So
that's cool.
But I don't remember the tension quite as vividly maybe as John did. Internally, he might have been thinking, that sounded really convincing, from the delegate, Mr. Hostetter. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with that. But now there's sets of eyes looking at me to say, what am I going to do?
Well, and as you guys, kind of as you were each describing both in this section and previously, about some of the earlier things you've said, it makes me think about, Dad, I don't even know if you had those 3 commitments in place when you guys started the mentoring relationship, but those 3 commitments that you've talked about and just kind of the commitment to, it sounds like both of you, there was mutual humility. I'm sure it wasn't perfect, but mutual humility and mutual honesty. And that kind of started, in the kind of just life on life. But then kind of carrying through trips together and through, really honest conversations about finances and things like that. It's just interesting to see. Do you think, is that how you would see your relationship, or does that fit with how you've seen it?
No, I think it's true. I think that, maybe you could say that in the beginning, I kind of set the standard or quality of kind of interaction that we were going to have, by my honesty and hopefully at points by my humility. But but Bob met
Mm-hmm.
that, like, and matched
Mm-hmm.
it. And so, when that's how your friendship begins, and then you kind of keep it at that
Mm-hmm.
level, then you go through life, and you go to Central Asia, and you're on the board, and you do stuff. But in some ways, it's the same two brothers, same two friends interacting the way that they always have. And that's one of the great things about the friendship with Bob is, we could be on the phone today and we would basically interact the same way we have for 30 years. It's the same. I mean, we've grown and matured, and we've grown individually, but we've even grown to understand each other more. But it's still two guys interacting the same way.
That's cool. And then what about, I know we need to kind of move along, but what about with Bob and Heather's involvement in Leadership Edge's work in Dallas? Bob, you want to, go for it.
Let me start on that one. That's been like tremendous. Like, I hadn't really interacted a lot with Bob, for a few years there. I mean, we would talk maybe every year or so, but not a lot. And so then, in one of the cities where we have kind of a concentration of work, Bob and Heather land in Dallas. And so, of course, at Leadership Edge, we're like, wonder what we could do with this. And so before you know it, Bob and Heather have hosted a leadership event at their home. And interestingly, one of the guys who's one of our leaders in Dallas, Bob and Heather had actually had him over when they were living in Connecticut, and somehow they still, there's a connection there. So I've said through the years that networking is a secular term for God's sovereignty, and that you meet all these people, and then over time you begin to see God's purposes. And I think in mine and Bob's friendship, and really in Bob's relationship to Leadership Edge, it started 30 years ago, but God just keeps evolving the iterations and the ways that it's going to manifest next. So I'll just say, I'm really glad they're in Dallas.
That's awesome. Bob, anything you want to add? Oh,
yeah.
It's only been 2 years. It feels like about 2 years. And so we're looking forward to all the ways that we can get plugged in, and the ways that Leadership Edge is a part of that. We really like it here. It's been great for our family. And, I think that there's a lot of, if anyone's listening to this who's in Dallas, I think the community of Leadership Edge in Dallas is phenomenal. The quality of the people are just great. And I would just encourage, folks who maybe are looking for some of these, for some relationships that are focused on these kinds of core elements, and then also some looking for some, godly wisdom in the area of leadership. I think it's a great organization. It's nothing like what it was when, we were going first, but it's a neat proposition for many. And so it's neat to see so many find that to be a home for them, particularly, folks that are kind of 30-ish or something like that. I think it's been great for people who are that life stage.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, Bob, as you know, the Leadership Edge life statement or life vision statement is, by God's grace, to step forward as God's man or woman in my spheres of influence to serve his purposes for his glory. So what has that come to mean to you, and how is that, or does that serve to kind of help guide life for you? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and I think I mentioned, that a little bit earlier, and the idea of stepping forward and how that's impacted. And I think that's right. I think that the rejecting passivity and moving forward, taking action, is something that I think meant, a lot to me, and I think was important, probably in my 20s and 30s. I think now the real question, that I wrestle with is, what does it mean to be, God's man, right? In that context, God's man or woman. What does it mean for me to be God's man? And what is that, what does it mean to be counted as his? And I think that is the real, the real nut of the question, frankly, in terms of, processing everything that's been happening, from, this seems to be accelerating in our world. There's a lot of changes that are happening. And I think it can, everybody went through COVID, but it's more than just COVID. There's lots of change driven by, technology, driven by a lot of different things. And so, I think that is something that increasingly is a guidepost for me around what does it mean to navigate? Does this decision acting as God's man, or is this decision acting as something else? So that's, I think, the most important. I think that's that to me is the part of the vision statement that I'm wrestling with.
So like it kind of in a world where it can be easy to lose your bearings, it kind of like casts vision. Is that roughly what you?
It does, and it casts, in all different kinds of spheres of influence, right? So in the sphere of influence of professionally, what does that look like? What are things that, what organizations are important to be a part of? What organizations are, less important, perhaps even detrimental? How do you, associate, given that, we bear that responsibility effectively. And so, and then also, what does it mean as a parent, as a father to my kids? There's all kinds of implications of what it means to not be your own and to be constrained by that.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Well, as we wrap up, I'd love to toss it back to you guys, like just to hear about, we've kind of talked about the friendship that's developed over time. So either of you can go first on this, but I guess, can you tell us just a few words, like how you've gone from mentor and mentee to friends and brothers, and maybe like, I don't know, what the relationship has meant?
Well, it's been great from my perspective. I just think that what maybe hasn't come out fully in this discussion is that John and I could not be more different people in terms of the way that we're set up. I'm very tasked, very idea oriented. John is very, relationship oriented, very steady. I tend to want to move fast. John is, thoughtful and deliberate. And so, what's really been great is that God has blessed that. God has blessed that. John mentioned in terms of iron sharpening iron, or how it's blessed that from my perspective in terms of my ability to pull away and see, where I have a blind spot. And it sounds like maybe John feels that same way. And so that to me is the thing that I think, I keep coming back to. We have this, I still remember being humbled by, the way that John, you can tell a story about the whole, PowerPoint slides and things like that. But, it just goes to illustrate we have very different styles. I wanted everything to be super detailed and explain. John had a few bullet points. And I said, what is that, John? Like, come on, you got up your game. And then, now I use, 5 bullet points when I speak. So it comes full circle.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I think that one of the great blessings of my life next to our family is just friends like Bob. Like when I started my adult life, I never imagined that throughout the decades that consistently God would be forging some friendships with some brothers in Christ that would be lifelong friends. And I am a better man and a better Christian because of them. And Bob has sure kind of proven his trust and trustworthiness in our friendship. And so I think my wrap-up thought is just I'm a grateful man, and I never imagined going into this just the effect that God was going to bring with the kind of friends it was going to generate through the years. So I think that's how I would wrap that up.
Awesome. Yeah, I think my takeaway is just, I think there are a lot of great things about humility and honesty and the impact that has on relationships, but maybe also, Dad, with what you just said of like living a life, investing in people is like just such a worthwhile life to live, and you do see the faithfulness of God in that. So, would you wrap us up?
Yeah. Oh, I sure will. Well, Bob, again, just thank you. I know you've got a lot to be doing, and appreciate you taking this time out to be with us. And for our listeners, we're so glad that you're here. We hope that the podcast has been of help to you. Please feel free to go to our website, lead-edge.com, and you'll find all kinds of resources there on leadership development and mentoring, and learn more about what we're up to. So we're glad you're with us, listeners. And Laura, I'll let you wrap it up.
Okay. Thanks, Dad, and thanks, listeners, for joining us.
Listeners, if you would like more perspectives on life, leadership, and mentoring, please go to the Leadership Edge website at lead-edge.com. Or if you have questions or ideas about future podcasts, please reach out to us at lei@lead-edge.com. We look forward to hearing from you.